In the most impenetrable depths of space swirled the void, a prison cloaked in shadows and whispered rumors. It was here that Jack found himself shackled, the metallic clang of his chains echoing through the cold, sterile hallways as guards led him to his new home. A cramped cell he was to share with a creature he'd only heard of in frightening tales, a space wolf named Erax. As the cell door slammed shut with a resounding thud, Jack surveyed his dim surroundings and finally glanced at his cellmate. Erax's fur, a deep shade of midnight blue, bristled as she sized him up with piercing golden eyes. Her reputation preceded her, known across the galaxies for her species' fierce combat skills and unwavering loyalty. Yet, there she lay, seemingly indifferent to his arrival. Jack broke the silence, his voice steady but cautious. "So, you're Erax? I heard about your kind. Never thought I'd see one up close." Erax shifted her massive head toward him, her gaze unblinking. After a moment she spoke, her voice a deep growl softened by a curious tone. "And you are a human. Jack, was it? Not many of your kind end up here. What did you do?" "Got framed is what I did," Jack replied, settling onto the thin, ragged mattress that barely cushioned the hard cot. "I'm innocent. But I guess that doesn't matter much in here, does it?" A low rumble emanated from Erax's throat, almost like a chuckle. "No, it does not. We are all guilty in the eyes of those who sent us here." Jack looked around the small cell, noticing scratch marks on the walls, tallying days or perhaps years by previous occupants. He felt the weight of the place pressing down on him. "How do you stand it?" he asked, not hiding the desperation in his voice. "By remembering who I am and why I fight," Erax replied, her tone more reflective. She moved closer, her large body making the small space feel even smaller. "You must find your own way, Jack." He sighed, feeling the hopelessness of their situation. "Maybe we can find a way together. They might have thrown us in here to forget about us, but I'm not ready to give up just yet." Erax tilted her head, considering his words. "Nor am I. Perhaps there is strength in numbers, even if it's just the two of us." Jack nodded, feeling a flicker of camaraderie in the dark. "Let's start by figuring out what we can do, not just to survive, but to get out of here. I have a feeling you're not the kind to give up easily." "Nor are you, it seems," Erax responded, her tail thumping against the floor. "Very well, human. We will work together." Their conversation stretched into the hours, each sharing their skills and stories, weaving a fragile bond in the darkness of the galaxy's most feared prison. Jack realized that despite their differences, they shared a common goal, freedom, and perhaps, just perhaps, together they could find it. Inside the prison's common area, Jack and Erax found themselves in the midst of a cacophony of alien dialects and the metallic clinks of chains. As they navigated through the crowded space, Jack could feel the heavy gazes of dozens of inmates, each curious or cautious about the unusual pairing of a human and a space wolf. Jack leaned closer to Erax, his voice low. "How do we blend in here without sticking out too much?" Erax sniffed the air, her senses picking up the subtle cues of the room. "Follow my lead, and match my pace. We'll need allies, and I know how to find them." Their first interaction was with a burly creature known as Dawn, a Goliath from the mining asteroids of Creon. He eyed them with a mixture of interest and suspicion as they approached his table. "Never thought I'd see a Terracan space wolf teaming up with a human," Dawn rumbled, his voice echoing slightly off the metal walls. "We're full of surprises," Jack replied with a half-smile, extending a hand. "I'm Jack. This is Erax." Dawn's massive hand enveloped Jack's in a firm shake. "Dawn, what brings you to my corner?" "We're looking to keep our heads down and maybe make a few friends," Jack said, glancing around to ensure no guards were paying close attention. "Heard you might be someone worth knowing." Perhaps, Dawn nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed them. You help me out during the next supply drop, and I might just consider you friends. Arax stepped forward, her stature alone commanding respect. And what does this help entail? Dawn smirked, his tusks gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Just a little diversion. Nothing too risky. As they agreed to the plan, Jack felt the stakes rising. They returned to their cell later, their minds busy with the details. "Do you trust him?" Jack asked as they entered their cell, the door closing with a definitive clang. "Not fully," Arax admitted, settling onto her cot. "But Dawn has influence here. It's a strategic move." Jack sat opposite her, their knees almost touching due to the cramped space. "We're going to need to rely on each other heavily if we're going to pull this off. You sure you're up for this?" Arax looked him directly in the eyes, her expression stern yet reassuring. "I trust you, Jack. And that's enough for me. We watch each other's backs." The following days were a blur of planning and subtle preparations. They spent evenings whispering plans, each session bringing them closer, their partnership strengthening beyond mere convenience. During one such planning session, Jack observed, back on Earth, wolves are seen as symbols of loyalty and teamwork. "Seems fitting, you being here." Arax's ears perked up at this, a slight huff escaping her lips that could have been a laugh. "And humans are known for their cunning and adaptability. Also fitting." As they shared a quiet moment, Jack realized how much he had come to value Arax's presence, not just as a partner in escape, but as a friend in a place where trust was as rare as freedom. Their bond, formed under the most unlikely and harsh conditions, was becoming their greatest asset. Under the dim flicker of the cell block lights, Jack and Arax huddled over a scrap of paper, a rough sketch of the prison layout between them. The air was thick with the musty stench of damp metal, but their focus was unyielding, their whispers barely audible over the distant hums and clanks that perpetually echoed through the corridors of the void. Jack pointed at a mark he had made on the paper. "This is the ventilation system here. It's less secure, barely monitored. Could be our way out during the transfer chaos." Arax studied the map with keen eyes. "And the guards? Their shifts change right at the hour, correct?" "Exactly," Jack confirmed, his finger tracing the path they would need to take. "We have a 7-minute window. It's tight, but it's the best shot we have." Just then, the sound of footsteps approached their cell. Jack swiftly tucked the map away, and they both assumed a nonchalant posture as a new figure appeared at the bars, a fellow inmate known as Moreau, a slender man with a sharp gaze that missed nothing. "Evening, Jack, Arax." Moreau greeted them with a nod, his voice a soft hiss that carried a hint of an accent. "Heard you two were cooking up something. Mind if I join?" Jack exchanged a glance with Arax, who gave a subtle nod of approval. "Sure, Moreau. We could use another set of eyes on our plan." Moreau slipped into the cell as the door buzzed briefly to allow entry. He looked at the blank spot on the floor where the map had been seconds earlier and smirked. "Not easy to trust in a place like this, I see. Wise." Arax moved aside to let Moreau sit down. "Trust is earned, Moreau. You know how it is." Moreau's eyes gleamed with a mix of curiosity and caution. "I do, indeed. So, what's the escape plan?" Jack outlined their strategy, detailing the timing and their roles. Moreau listened intently, his brow furrowing in concentration. After Jack finished, Moreau leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "It's good, but you're missing a key distraction. The guards will be on high alert during any transfer. You need something big to pull their attention." "And what do you suggest?" Arax asked, her tone indicating she was impressed but not fully convinced. Miro's lips curled into a sly grin. "Leave that to me. I have a few contacts who owe me favors. Can make sure the guards are preoccupied." Jack felt a surge of adrenaline at the prospect. "All right, Miro. You set up your part, and we'll handle ours. We all get one shot at this." They spent the next hour finalizing every detail, Miro's insights proving invaluable. As the meeting concluded, Miro stood, stretching his limbs with a sense of satisfaction. "This is going to work. Just make sure you're ready when the time comes." After Miro left, Jack turned to Erax, his expression serious. "Do you think we can trust him?" Erax's tail thumped against the ground, a sign Jack had come to recognize as contemplation. "Miro is self-interested enough to want out as badly as we do. He'll stick to the plan." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of their decisions. "Then we'd better get some rest. We'll need all our strength to pull this off." As they settled into their respective corners for the night, the darkness of the cell seemed a little less oppressive, their shared goal a tangible thread pulling them towards a future they dared to seize. They were no longer just inmates but allies, bound by a plan that promised freedom, or failure. As the harsh lights of the prison transfer ships holding bay flickered on, Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His wrists were bound, as were Erax's, albeit with specialized restraints that could contain her formidable strength. Around them, the other prisoners remained silent, their eyes fixed on the walls as the guards barked orders. Jack leaned slightly toward Erax. "This is it," he murmured. "You ready?" Her golden eyes met his, and she gave a subtle nod. "As ready as I'll ever be." Ahead of them, a heavily armored guard moved through the rows of seated inmates, checking each restraint with an efficiency that spoke of years on the job. Jack tensed as the guard approached, but Miro, seated 2 rows ahead, chose that moment to begin a low, deliberate cough. The guard stopped, glaring down at Miro. "What's your problem?" "Not feeling so great," Miro rasped. "Maybe something I ate?" He leaned forward, coughing louder and more violently. The guard sighed and gestured to another officer to take Miro to a side chamber. As the pair moved off, Miro caught Jack's eye and gave the faintest nod. Jack turned his attention back to Erax. "That's our cue. You know the drill." Erax flexed her bound claws ever so slightly. "It's all timing now." Just as they'd planned, the ventilation system above them issued a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. That was Dawn's signal. He had managed to block one of the ship's air recycling units, triggering an internal systems check. The guards now had 2 problems to deal with: Miro's supposed illness and a malfunctioning vent system. Their attention was scattered. When the guard passed by again, Jack and Erax simultaneously adjusted their positions. Jack pulled a small, hidden pin from under his sleeve, smuggled in thanks to Miro's contact on the maintenance crew. Erax, with her acute senses, listened carefully for the approach of other guards. "Jack, quickly," she said, her ears swiveling at a faint sound down the corridor. Jack worked the pin into the lock on his wrist restraints. It took longer than he hoped, his fingers trembling slightly. Erax leaned closer. "Focus," she whispered. "You've done this before." I know," Jack muttered, his hands steadying. The lock gave a faint click, and the restraints fell away. He wasted no time, moving to Erax's cuffs. Within moments, she was free too. "Now what?" Erax asked, keeping her voice low. Jack pulled the map from inside his boot, the folded scrap already well worn from their constant planning. "Vent access is through the service hatch 2 decks down. We need to move now before they get Miro back." Erax's claws flexed as she rose. "Lead the way, Jack. I'll watch our backs." The pair moved swiftly but carefully, blending into the background noise of the ship. A few stray prisoners glanced their way but made no effort to stop them. Most had their own plans, their own secrets to keep. Jack and Erax slipped into the narrow maintenance corridors, following the map's route. As they reached the service hatch, Jack paused to listen. The corridor was silent save for the distant hum of engines. "Looks clear," he whispered. Erax inspected the hatch, her claws deftly finding the release mechanism. "This'll take a minute. Keep an eye out." Jack stood guard while Erax worked, his nerves on edge. He couldn't stop replaying the plan in his head, checking for any gaps they might have missed. The sound of footsteps nearby sent a jolt through him. He turned to see a guard at the end of the corridor, frozen in surprise at the sight of two escaped inmates. "Hey!" the guard shouted, reaching for his weapon. "Move!" Jack hissed to Erax. She managed to pull the hatch open just as the guard advanced. Without hesitation, Jack shoved the guard into the wall, a desperate but effective maneuver. Erax grabbed Jack's arm, yanking him through the hatch, and they both fell into the vent shaft. "Go, go!" Erax urged as the guard's shouts grew louder. The ventilation tunnels were cramped and dark, the metallic walls pressing in on all sides. Jack led the way, the map in his mind as much as in his hand. Behind him, Erax crawled swiftly, her sharp claws clicking softly against the metal. They emerged into the ship's central cargo hold, a vast chamber filled with crates and machinery. Jack pointed to the far side. "There. The emergency escape pods. That's our way out." "Not so fast." Erax sniffed the air. "Guards ahead." Jack peered around a stack of crates and spotted a group of guards standing near the escape pods. He turned back to Erax, whispering, "We'll need a distraction." Erax's eyes gleamed. "Leave that to me." Before Jack could stop her, Erax darted to the side, knocking over a precarious stack of crates. The resulting crash was deafening. The guards turned in unison, weapons drawn, as Erax darted between the stacks, her agility keeping her just out of their reach. Jack seized the opportunity. While the guards were occupied chasing Erax, he slipped around the crates, reaching the controls for the escape pods. His fingers flew over the console, inputting the coordinates they'd memorized. As soon as the pod's door hissed open, Jack whistled sharply. Erax reappeared at his side in an instant, her fur slightly singed from a close encounter with a guard's stun weapon. "You're insane," she panted, though her tone carried a hint of admiration. "And you're reckless," Jack shot back, though he couldn't help but grin. "Get in." They scrambled into the pod and slammed the door shut. Jack hit the launch button, and the pod's engines roared to life. Through the tiny viewport, they saw the guards racing toward them, too late to stop their escape. As the pod shot into the vast expanse of space, Jack leaned back in his seat, breathing heavily. "We did it," he said, the realization sinking in. "We're out." Erax sat beside him, her fur ruffled, her sharp teeth visible in what could almost be called a smile. "For now," she said. "We still have a long way to go." Jack nodded, glancing at the stars outside. They had escaped the ship, but their journey was just beginning. Together they had defied the odds, and together they would face whatever came next. The escape pod had landed hard, skimming across the moon's rocky surface before coming to a grinding halt in a shallow crater. Jack pried the hatch open, wincing at the sharp pain in his shoulder. Erax pushed past him, her claws gripping the pod's outer shell as she peered out at the alien terrain. "I don't like this place," she said, sniffing the air. "It feels wrong." Jack clambered out after her, taking in the landscape. The moon was dimly lit by a far-off star, its surface covered in jagged ridges and peculiar, spiraling rock formations. An eerie blue mist hung low, twisting through the valleys. "Well, it's not exactly a vacation spot," he replied, shielding his eyes from the thin, biting wind. "But it'll have to do. The ship's scanners won't find us here, at least not right away." Arax moved a few paces ahead, her ears swiveling as she listened. "And the locals? You think they'll be friendly?" Jack shrugged, holding his side where a bruise was already forming. "Friendly or not, we're stuck here until we can figure out our next move." They set off toward the nearest rocky outcrop, staying low and alert. Jack carried a small, emergency survival kit he'd found in the escape pod, barely enough supplies to last a few days. Arax, as always, relied on her keen senses, sniffing out edible plants and potential threats. "We need to find shelter," Arax said after a while, pausing to look back at Jack. "That wind's only going to get worse, and the temperature's dropping." Jack nodded, scanning the horizon. His boots crunched against the gravelly surface as he followed her lead. "What about that ridge up ahead? Looks like it might have some overhangs or caves." Arax studied the ridge, her tail flicking thoughtfully. "Worth a shot. Let's go." The climb to the ridge was steep and treacherous. Jack slipped more than once, his hands scraped raw from gripping the rough stone. Arax offered him a paw at one point, helping him up a particularly tricky ledge. They reached a small cave just as the wind picked up, howling through the valleys below. Inside, it was dark and cramped, but at least it was sheltered. Jack pulled out a small, portable light from the survival kit, illuminating the space. The walls were smooth, almost unnaturally so, and the floor was littered with strange, crystal-like shards that glowed faintly in the dim light. "This place. It's not natural," Arax muttered, touching one of the walls with a claw. Jack sank onto a rock, catching his breath. "It's shelter. That's good enough for now." They set up a small camp, rationing the limited food and water. Arax ventured outside to scout the area while Jack rested, but she returned quickly, her fur on edge. "Something's out there," she said, pacing the cave. "I saw shapes moving in the mist. They're watching us." Jack grabbed the makeshift weapon he'd fashioned from a piece of metal debris. "How many? Did they look armed?" "I couldn't tell," Arax replied. "They stayed back, just watching, waiting." Jack considered their options. If they wanted to attack, they would have done it already. "Maybe they're curious. Maybe we can talk to them." Arax stopped pacing and turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You think we can trust them?" "I think," Jack said slowly, "that we don't have much choice. If they know this place, they might have resources or information. We can't survive out here on our own for long." Arax hesitated, then sighed. "All right. But if they make one wrong move, I'm not holding back." Jack couldn't suppress a smile. "Wouldn't expect you to." The next morning, they left the cave cautiously, heading toward where Arax had seen the figures. The blue mist was thicker now, swirling around their feet as they walked. Jack gripped his makeshift weapon tightly, while Arax led the way, her ears constantly twitching at the slightest sound. It wasn't long before they saw them, tall, slender beings with elongated limbs and translucent skin that shimmered in the dim light. They stood in a semicircle, their large, unblinking eyes fixed on Jack and Arax. Jack held up his hands, showing he wasn't a threat. "We don't mean any harm," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. "We're just looking for a way off this moon." The aliens didn't respond at first, merely staring. Then one stepped forward, its movements smooth and deliberate. It tilted its head, as if examining Jack and Arax, then raised a hand and made a series of intricate gestures. Jack looked at Arax. "You understand any of that?" Arax shook her head. "No, but—" "Wait. Look." The alien reached into a pouch at its side and pulled out a small, glowing crystal. It held the crystal out toward them, its expression unreadable. "What do you think it wants?" Jack whispered. Erax sniffed the air, then nodded. "It's not hostile. I think it's offering it to us." Jack stepped forward cautiously and accepted the crystal. As soon as it touched his skin, a wave of warmth and energy coursed through him. The alien gestured again, pointing toward the horizon, where a faint structure could be seen through the mist. "They're showing us the way," Jack said. "Erax, I think they want to help." Erax still looked wary, but she didn't argue. Together, they followed the alien's gestures, making their way toward the distant structure. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the moon held far more mysteries than they could imagine, but for now they had allies, strange and silent, but allies nonetheless. And in their current predicament, that was more than they could have hoped for. The structure ahead emerged slowly through the mist, a low, angular building half submerged in the rock. Jagged spires jutted from its roof like the remains of some ancient, alien cathedral. As Jack and Erax approached, the aliens that had been leading them stopped abruptly. They stood silent, their translucent forms nearly blending into the blue-grey fog. Jack turned to one of them. "This is as far as you'll take us?" The tallest alien tilted its head slightly, then gestured toward the building with a smooth wave of its elongated arm. Jack frowned, hoping for a verbal answer, but none came. He sighed and looked at Erax. "I guess it's just us now." Erax shifted her weight, sniffing the air. "I don't trust this place. Something feels off." "Well," Jack said, gripping his makeshift weapon a little tighter, "if we want to get off this moon, we've got to take some risks. Come on." The two of them stepped cautiously toward the structure, the aliens silently retreating into the mist behind them. As they drew closer, they noticed faint etchings on the dark surface, patterns of circles and lines that seemed to pulse faintly when touched by the filtered light from the distant star. The entrance was a low, triangular doorway partially blocked by rubble. Jack knelt and began clearing the stones. "We've come this far. No sense in turning back now." Erax helped, using her claws to pull aside larger chunks of debris. Her strength made quick work of the smaller boulders, and soon they had cleared enough of the opening to squeeze through. Jack ducked inside, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The air inside was cold and dry, with a faint metallic tang. The walls were smooth and curved, glowing faintly with the same light as the exterior etchings. The space felt oddly organic, like stepping inside a living shell. Jack moved carefully, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet chamber. "Let's stick together," Erax said, her voice low. "I don't want to get separated in this maze." "Agreed," Jack replied. "We'll move slow, stay alert." They began exploring the structure, their movements cautious and deliberate. The corridors twisted and turned in seemingly impossible ways, looping back on themselves and then branching off into more tunnels. The faint glow along the walls pulsed rhythmically, casting shifting shadows that made the space feel alive. After a while, they entered a larger chamber. In the center stood a pedestal holding a crystal similar to the one the aliens had given them, but much larger. The crystal emitted a soft hum, its light shifting through a spectrum of colors. Jack stepped closer, drawn to it. "What do you think this is?" Erax circled the pedestal warily. "Some kind of power source? Or maybe it's the reason this place still has air and light." "Maybe." Jack reached out but stopped short of touching it. He turned to Erax. "Should we take it?" Erax's ears twitched. "Let's not be too hasty. We don't know what it does, or what might happen if we remove it." Jack nodded, withdrawing his hand. "Good point. Let's see if there's anything else here. something we can use to get out of this place. They searched the chamber, finding more markings on the walls and strange, pod-like devices arranged around the perimeter. Jack studied the pods, his brow furrowed. What are these? Escape pods, maybe? Not like any I've seen, Erax said, sniffing at one. But it's possible. They look like they could hold one of those aliens, though, not us. Jack shrugged. At this point, I'll take whatever we can get. If these things can get us off the moon. Before he could finish, a deep, resonant sound reverberated through the chamber. Both Jack and Erax spun toward the pedestal. The crystal at its center was glowing brighter, and the hum had grown louder. "Did we do that?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with unease. "I don't think so," Erax replied, backing up slightly. "But it might mean we're not alone." As if on cue, a door they hadn't noticed before slid open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the faint light. The figure stepped into the room, a humanoid shape, but its skin shimmered with the same translucent quality as the aliens they'd encountered outside. It moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if trying not to startle them. Jack raised his weapon instinctively, but the figure raised its hands in a gesture of peace. It spoke, though the words didn't match any language Jack knew. He looked to Erax, who shook her head. "I don't understand it either." The figure tried again, its tone calm and measured. Finally, it gestured toward the pedestal, then back to them, as if asking a question. Jack lowered his weapon slightly. "I think it wants to know why we're here." Erax stepped forward cautiously. "We're trying to leave," she said, her voice firm but not threatening. "We need a way off this moon." The figure tilted its head, then pointed to the crystal. Its shimmering skin flickered as it gestured toward the pods along the walls, then back to the crystal. "It's saying the pods need the crystal," Jack guessed, glancing at Erax. "We take it, and they'll work. Or at least, that's what I think." Erax's tail flicked, her body tense. "And if we take it, what happens to this place, and the creatures outside?" Jack hesitated, his mind racing. If the crystal powered the pods, it might be their only chance at escape. But if removing it harmed the structure, or the aliens who had helped them, could they really take that risk? The figure waited silently, its luminous gaze fixed on them. The chamber felt colder, quieter, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jack exchanged a look with Erax, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on both of them. "Let's think this through," Jack said, his voice low. "We might only get one shot at this. We need to make sure we choose wisely." Jack's knuckles whitened as he tightened his grip on the glowing crystal. Beside him, Erax remained as still as a statue, her golden eyes locked on the shimmering figure standing before them. The atmosphere in the chamber grew heavier with each passing second, the faint hum of the crystal the only sound between them. "I don't like this," Erax murmured under her breath. "What if it's a trap?" Jack hesitated. "What choice do we have?" he replied softly. "If this thing powers the pods, we might finally have a way off this moon." The translucent figure tilted its head, its expression unreadable. Slowly, it raised an arm, pointing first to the crystal, then to the pods arranged around the chamber. Its movement was deliberate, almost patient. "I think it's trying to tell us how to use them," Jack whispered. "We take the crystal, and the pods will activate. It's like a key." Erax didn't look convinced. "And what happens when we pull it out? What happens to the moon, the aliens, if we make the wrong move?" Before she could finish, a deep rumble reverberated through the chamber. Jack looked up sharply, his heart pounding. The figure's luminescence began to flicker, and the walls pulsed with an ominous glow. It gestured urgently now, as if urging them to act before it was too late. "No time for second-guessing," Jack said firmly. "We do this together." Reluctantly, Erax stepped closer. "Fine. But if this goes south, I'm not sticking around." Jack reached out and placed his hands on the crystal. It was warm, its surface smooth and strangely inviting. The moment he lifted it from its pedestal, a wave of energy rippled outward. The pods around the room hummed to life, their smooth surfaces splitting open to reveal seats and controls. "It worked!" Jack exclaimed. "Erax, let's—" But before he could finish, a loud crash sounded from behind them. Jack and Erax spun around to see the chamber's entrance caving in. A group of armed figures emerged from the shadows. Prison guards, their weapons drawn, their faces set with grim determination. "How did they find us?" Jack muttered, his mind racing. One of the guards stepped forward, a smug grin on his scarred face. "You really thought you could run forever, didn't you? We've been tracking you since the crash. The locals were more helpful than you realized." Jack's stomach sank. He looked at Erax, who bared her teeth in a low growl. "Miro," she said coldly. "He sold us out." The guard smirked. "Your little friend gave us everything we needed. Said you two would lead us straight to something valuable. And he was right." The guards advanced, their weapons trained on Jack and Erax. The figure that had helped them stepped back, its shimmering form dimming as the tension in the room escalated. Jack glanced at the crystal in his hands, then at the pods. They had come so far, endured so much. Was this the end? "We're not going back," Jack said, his voice steady. "Not now, not ever." Erax's growl deepened. "What's the plan?" Jack's mind worked frantically. The pods were their only chance. "We hold them off long enough to get into one of the pods. If I can connect the crystal to the control panel, we might be able to launch before they can stop us." Erax crouched low, ready to pounce. "Then let's make it quick." As the guards closed in, Jack and Erax sprang into action. Erax lunged forward, her powerful frame a blur of motion. She knocked two guards aside with a single swipe of her claws, sending their weapons skittering across the floor. Jack darted toward the nearest pod, gripping the crystal tightly. "Cover me!" he shouted. Erax moved with a feral grace, weaving between the guards and keeping them at bay. Jack reached the pod and slammed the crystal into the waiting slot on the control panel. The pod's interior lights flickered on, and the control screen displayed a sequence of alien symbols. Jack's fingers flew across the controls, trying to decipher the commands. Behind him, Erax let out a sharp yelp. Jack turned just in time to see her pinned by one of the guards, her claws scrabbling against his armor. Another guard was aiming his weapon directly at her. "Get off her!" Jack shouted, grabbing a nearby rod and hurling it at the guard. The improvised projectile struck him squarely in the head, sending him sprawling. Erax surged to her feet and leaped at the next guard, her teeth bared. "Hurry up, Jack," she called over her shoulder. "I'm trying," Jack shouted back, his hands trembling as he worked. Finally, the pod's controls shifted into a configuration he understood. The engine whirred to life, and the hatch opened. "It's ready. Get in." Erax fought her way free of the last guard and bolted toward the pod. Jack reached out, pulling her inside just as the remaining guards fired. The pod's hatch sealed, the blasts ricocheting harmlessly off the hull. "Hang on!" Jack yelled, hitting the launch sequence. The pod shuddered, then shot upward with a deafening roar. Through the viewport, Jack and Erax saw the chamber shrinking below them, the guards left standing in a haze of dust and light. The alien figure, now barely visible, raised its hand in a final, enigmatic gesture before the pod rocketed into the atmosphere. As the moon's surface faded into the distance, Jack collapsed back in his seat, his heart racing. Erax sat beside him, panting from exertion but very much alive. "You always know how to get us into trouble," she said, her voice tinged with relief. Jack managed a weary smile. "And out of it. Don't forget that part." They stared out at the vast expanse of stars ahead, the tension of the escape slowly ebbing away. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself a moment of hope. They were free, at least for now. Together, they had beaten the odds once again. The stars stretched infinitely before them, twinkling softly against the deep black canvas of space. Jack sat slumped in the pilot's seat of the escape pod, his body aching but his mind buzzing. He glanced at Erax, who was examining the console beside him. Her claws tapped at the screen, trying to make sense of the alien script that scrolled past. "This thing's navigation system isn't exactly user-friendly," she muttered. "You sure you know what you're doing?" Jack smirked weakly. "Do I ever? Just keep trying to decode that map. I'll focus on making sure we don't run out of power." The pod's hum was steady, its systems purring along without issue for the moment. They had left the moon far behind, but they were far from safe. Jack had been able to power up the pod's engines and put some distance between them and their pursuers, but they were drifting now, with no clear destination. "So," Erax said after a long silence, her golden eyes flicking to Jack, "what's the plan exactly?" "Wander through space until we stumble upon a friendly face." Jack shrugged, rubbing a bruise on his shoulder. "Pretty much. Unless you've got a better idea." Erax's ears twitched in irritation, but she kept her tone even. "You're a terrible strategist, you know that?" "Thanks," Jack said dryly. "But if you remember, our last plan worked out pretty well. We're still breathing, aren't we?" "Fair enough," Erax admitted, leaning back in her seat. "But we need to find a place to land soon. We're running low on rations, and I'd rather not find out how long we can survive on this thing." Jack rubbed his temples, staring at the faint star chart displayed on the console. Most of it was unreadable, alien characters mingled with abstract symbols that defied logic. "If we can just get close to a trade route, someone might pick up our signal. There have to be other ships out there." Erax snorted. "And what if they're not friendly? Not everyone's going to welcome us with open arms." "Then we deal with that when it happens," Jack said firmly. "One step at a time." They worked in silence for a while, each focusing on the task at hand. Jack monitored the pod's power levels and environmental controls, while Erax pored over the navigation data, occasionally growling in frustration. Despite the tension, their teamwork had become almost seamless, a far cry from the guarded, mistrustful partnership they had started with. After what felt like hours, Erax let out a triumphant sound. "I think I've got something. There's a small trading colony not too far from here. If this map's to scale, that is." Jack perked up. "A trading colony? That's perfect. We can find food, supplies, maybe even a proper ship." "Don't get too excited," Erax said. "It's small. Might not have much in the way of resources. And we'll have to stay low. Someone might still be looking for us." "Better than drifting out here," Jack pointed out. "Set a course." Erax tapped a few more buttons, and the pod's engines adjusted their thrust. The stars outside the viewport shifted slightly as the pod turned toward its new destination. As the pod cruised silently through the void, Jack leaned back and let out a long breath. "You know," he said, glancing at Erax, "I wasn't sure if we'd ever get this far." Erax raised an eyebrow. "You doubting yourself, human?" "Not so much myself," Jack admitted. "But everything else?" "Yeah. I mean, Look at us. An escaped convict and a space wolf. Hardly the dream team. Erax chuckled, a low rumbling sound. I think we've done all right. All right. Jack laughed. We just escaped from the galaxy's deadliest prison, fought off a dozen armed guards, and stole an alien escape pod. I'd call that a bit more than all right. Erax's grin showed sharp teeth, but her eyes were warm. Fair point. Guess we're not such a bad team after all. The mood lightened, and for the first time in days, they allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. They had survived the worst. Now, they could start thinking about the future, about what came next. Once we reach that colony, Jack said, what's your plan? Erax thought for a moment, her tail flicking lazily. Find a quiet place. Maybe. Lay low. Keep out of trouble. That's it. Jack asked, raising an eyebrow. You're just going to disappear? She shrugged. Maybe not disappear. But I'm done fighting for now. I need some peace. Jack considered her words, then nodded slowly. I get it. Maybe I'll do the same. Erax glanced at him, her expression softening. Not a bad idea. You could use some peace, too. Their conversation drifted off, replaced by a comfortable silence. The stars outside seemed brighter now, their distant light a reminder that, despite everything, they had escaped the darkness of the past. The colony lay ahead, a chance at a fresh start. They didn't know what awaited them there, but they knew they'd face it together. And for now, that was enough.